now available in paperback and e-readers. Spellbound, a darker shade of black. Get your copy today at your favorite online bookseller. Is the goth subculture dead? I really don't think so. Now, I've heard a lot of people saying that the goth subculture is dead, and their reasons for saying that the goth subculture is dead is because they don't see people going out to the clubs, they don't see people going to different goth events, and because there aren't that many people going out to the clubs and to the events, they aren't hearing the music or experiencing the music in these venues. So some people believe that the goth subculture is dead and that the scene is dead. And you have to really take a look at the goth subculture from a panoramic perspective. And that's something I've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years, taking a look at the subculture from a panoramic perspective. And from the panoramic perspective, I see where the goth subculture is in the middle of change. And as I look at it from that panoramic perspective, I can just honestly say this. As long as there are people participating in the subculture isn't dead, but the way people are participating in the subculture is changing, because when I look at the goth subculture from that bigger picture, I can see a generation gap forming between two generations of goths. And the older generation of goths are pretty much seeing the scene is dead because the kids aren't coming into the venues that they used to know or to the events that they used to know, and they're not experiencing the music the way that they did back in the 80s and the 90s. Meanwhile, the millennial generation, they're experiencing a completely different goth subculture, and that subculture is pretty much based on the way they grew up and the culture that they grew up in. And the common thing that's leading to this generation gap pretty much is introversion. Now, a lot of people who are a part of the goth subculture are introverts, and they are inside themselves. And because your people are introverts, what they're doing is they're imagining things being worse than they actually are. I know this because I am an introvert myself, and oftentimes we do imagine things to be worse than what they actually are. And it's not until we go outside and experience real life that we understand what something truly is. And I see this generation gap forming because people just aren't talking to each other, and they feel uncomfortable talking to each other, because another thing that introverts struggle with is change. And introverts really, they have a hard time with change. And this generation gap is part of having to deal with many of the changes that are going on in the goth subculture right now, because we have the older generation of goths who want to try to keep what they had in the 90s, or try to relive parts of that great 90s era, which was one of the most golden eras of the subculture, where it was at the peak of its popularity. Then we have the millennial generation trying to discover the goth subculture from their perspective. And when it comes down to the younger generation, they have pretty much experienced a completely different world than the older generation of kids who came up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, the millennial generation, they're experiencing the goth subculture from their perspective, and they are interpreting the goth subculture from their perspective. And in their world, they pretty much have grown up very sheltered. Their parents have kept them in the house. They have not really gone out, and they really don't have an incentive to go out like the kids of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, because in our day, we had to go out as part of our survival skills. And moreover, we had to go out because that was the way we were socialized. Our education process was all about being social. Everything from gym class to recess to class parties to proms pretty much taught us how to be social. So when we went into the clubs to experience the music, what happened was that was a part of our rite of passage. That was one of the things that said we were an adult. However, today's generation is very insular. So the younger kids today, they experience a totally different culture because their mothers pretty much keep them at home. Their mothers pretty much shelter them. And the education process that they get socialized in pretty much isolates them. And in their education process, there is no gym. There is no recess. There are no school parties. There is no prom. So they aren't really socialized to transition into clubs. They're pretty much socialized in education pretty much to get skilled and drilled all day long. And this is something that many of my family members who work in education have told me, that these kids pretty much sit there all day getting skilled and drilled, and that pretty much impacts their socialization process because they aren't taught to go outside. They aren't taught to go out and experience life. And they are very isolated to the few places that they do go out in. So they aren't taught to, explore their communities or explore their neighborhoods like we used to do back in the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s, where we would go outside to different places and go out to do experience different things or take those trips to different places. They're very much taught to stay in one part of their area because of fear of being attacked or fear of being hurt. So they're taught a completely different thing. Moreover, they experience the music of the goth subculture completely different. Now, many people in the last 30 years, they pretty much experienced the goth subculture by discovering the music on the radio, music videos on places like MTV and VH1, or other music video shows. Like back in my day, we had U68 here in New York, and that's how we experienced a lot of the music. Or they went to clubs, or they went to concerts. These days, a lot of kids, they pretty much, if they want to learn about music, they go to YouTube or they go to Amazon.com and they download everything onto their smartphone or their iPod, and that's how they discover the music. So they really don't have an incentive to go to the club because everything is pretty much catering to them, and it's convenient for them to just go do a Google search, load up their iPhone or their iPod with all the goth music, or load up their laptop with all the goth music, and that's how they experience and discover the music. So they really don't need to go to the club or go to the events unless they really want to. And that's one of the core reasons why we see a lot of younger goths in different venues these days other than clubs or bars or places like some of the events that are out here. The reason why we see them in places like Starbucks or Barnes and Noble or at the public library is because that's the venues that a lot of them feel safe in, and that's a lot of the venues that their parents feel safe taking them to. So they pretty much are experiencing a completely different world because, again, they are sheltered, and their scene is completely different because they pretty much have been taught to pretty much be very isolated and very insular, so they go to the safe places that they feel comfortable in. Moreover, if they go to large gatherings, it's always related with something else, such as books or comic books or anime or manga. So oftentimes you'll see a younger goth. You won't see them at a club or a bar, but you will see them at a Comic Con, or you will see them at a anime or a manga con, or you will see them at, again, a Starbucks or a public library, because, again, this is the way they have been socialized, and these are the venues that they were socialized to be in. So as I look at it, the goth subculture is not dead. It's just moved to different places, and it's moved outside of the clubs and outside of the bars, and it's moved into different venues because the customer has moved to different venues. And because the customer has moved to a different venue, the younger customer, many people in the older generation, they believe that the scene is dead, when in actuality, the scene has pretty much just moved to a different place, and the people in the scene have moved to a different place. And they have moved there because, again, their parents have pretty much taught them a culture where they have to be safe, whereas back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, kids were pretty much taught to learn how to be on their own, pretty much learn how to do for themselves, and learn how to take responsibility for themselves. So they were always taught to go out and do for self, and that was part of their learning process. Whereas today, mommy and daddy pretty much want to make sure that their kids are safe, their kids are secure, and part of that had to do with events like 9/11 and many of these mass shootings and many of the violence that has gone on. So parents want them to go out of their way to protect their kids, so their kids learn to be insular. And it also has to do with the education policies, where kids have been taught, to be safe, where they're not taught to take risks. So we see a lot more kids going to different places to have their goth scene. And one of the safest places they have the goth scene is online, and that's why you see so many kids online in the goth subculture. You see a lot of YouTubers making videos, and you see a lot more people expressing themselves there because they feel it's safe. And that's why you see a lot of the goth subculture now online, because those kids don't feel comfortable, again, because a lot of people who are a part of the subculture are introverts. And an introvert is like this: they always imagine things to be worse than they are, so they feel afraid of expressing themselves. And as I look at the picture of the goth subculture from the panoramic perspective, I think one of the things that has to be done is that everybody has to really start facing their fears, young and old, because the subculture doesn't have to die. The subculture can live if everyone gets together and keeps it alive. Will it be the same as the golden era of the 90s? No, because the 90s were a different time. That was a completely different era, but we can have some of the experiences taught to those kids of today, and we can have some of the fun that those kids had in those 90s days today. And that all takes for the older people to share their experiences with the younger people and tell them about the experiences that they're having, like Angela Benedict does in her videos, and pretty much talk to them about them, and then try to create new venues for kids to pretty much have the same, almost a similar experience based on the culture that they have learned, and learning how to face their fears so that they can enjoy the subculture in the same way kids did in the 90s. Because as I look at it, the subculture can live if people allow it to live, and share it with each other, because a culture is based on the moral position of the people, and that moral position in the goth subculture is very strong because people are very passionate about the subculture and they want to keep it alive. So it's not going to die unless people want it to die. And I look at this subculture, and it's in a place where it's at a crossroads, but I believe the subculture can grow and be a great place for everyone. And the reason why it can be a great place for everyone, because everyone is so passionate about it, everyone cares about it so much, and everyone wants to share it with each other. A lot of the kids who are online, they're very enthusiastic and they want to learn more. And all it takes is for older people to go out and teach them about the subculture. And the only barrier that they have to overcome is being an introvert, and breaking down that wall is a lot easier than some people would think. A lot of people who are introverts, they think that the world is against them, or this person is being mean to them, when in many cases this person really wants to be your friend. They really want to share what they have, but it's how they approach things that pretty much can impact things and encourage somebody to learn more or discourage them. And yet it's just about how you approach people and how you present things to people that will get them more eager and more interested in learning more about the subculture. I see what has to be done is that there has to be a serious effort to bridge this generation gap in the subculture. And once this generation gap gets bridged, I believe that a lot of the kids who are feeling scared about going to places like these clubs and the goth places, for that the older kids used to go to in the 90s, will feel comfortable about going to those places and experiencing them. But it's all about making these kids who are introverts feel safe in those environments. Moreover, it's also about making their parents feel safe about sending their kids to these environments, because when it comes down to a lot of these parents, a lot of them are overprotective, a lot of them are scared, and a lot of them believe that this goth club is a horrific place. And we have to pretty much show people what the goth club is, what the experience is, and pretty much talk about things that go on in the goth club so that people will feel safe, the kids will feel safe, and they will feel like it's a place that they can feel just as comfortable in as the Barnes and Nobles, as the Starbucks, and the thrift stores that they go to all the time. And that this is a place that is a part of the culture that is open to them and wants to embrace them. And this is something that is, paramount to sharing the subculture and breaking down that wall between the younger goths and the older goths, and bringing back that magic, that people shared, that love that people shared when they went to these venues. So that's some of the things that people in the subculture have to do in order to pretty much you know, reach out to each other, because I see this as a generation gap, and it's a generation gap that I believe that can be easily bridged once people face their fears, break down these walls, and pretty much learn to connect with each other and get closer to each other and share all their experiences and make this subculture be as great as it was back in the 90s, or even better than it was in the 90s, because you'll have everyone wanting to share it and everyone presenting what's positive about it. And that's what's really the most important thing, showing the positive aspects of the goth subculture so everyone can see what's great about it. You can pretty much pick up my two goth novels, Spinsterella and Spellbound, on Amazon.com. And if you really like this channel, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.